Hello and welcome to The Beat, a news and talk program brought to you by the Center for Community Media at Worcester State University. I am your host, Paul Stevens, and today we will be interviewing Lew Stevens. Welcome back to Worcester State. You're an alumni.
I am.
Yeah, going back to the 80s, the early 80s.
Early 80s. The campus has changed a wee bit.
Yes.
And the library building too. But it's fun to be back on the campus.
So we have a few questions. How did you get started in the zoology field?
I got started as a volunteer. I was going to Worcester State at the time and started as a volunteer in the zoo department of the Ecotarium. Back then it was called the Worcester Science Center. Started volunteering. Back then the Ecotarium had polar bears, timber wolves, coyotes, stump-tailed macaques, a bit more exotic collection than what they currently have. And so I was volunteering, and then all of a sudden they started offering me a number of part-time jobs. Eventually I got up to about 35 hours, and I looked at the situation I found myself in, that, gee, I'm doing what I've always wanted to do. I'm enjoying myself. Maybe I don't need a college degree, and I actually quit.
That's right. That's right. You told me that.
And as luck would have it, when I made that decision, they hired me as a full-time keeper naturalist, and then 6 months later, the executive director at the time, Dick Kleber, the zoo director resigned, and Dick Kleber, the executive director, called me into his office and said, "Lew, I'd like you to run the zoo for me." And I said yes before he had a chance to change his mind.
Yeah.
So I was the zoo director there for 10 years, left there to run the children's zoo in Franklin Park for 3 or 4 years, and moved over to the Museum of Science in Boston for 30 years.
Yeah.
Till I retired.
That's right.
And moved down to Capron Park.
Now, to start at the museum, you needed your degree.
That's right. Back at the Science Center, after I'd been the zoo director there for about 5 or 6 years, I started to, I need to broaden my experience.
Sure.
So I started looking around, and I would pretty much always get the interview. But then when it came to whether or not you had your bachelor's degree or any degree, I'd of course say no, and never got the job. In fact, the first time I applied at the Museum of Science, the interview was going really well till that question was asked. And it took a few of those instances to say, you got to go back and finish this up. So I came back to Worcester State and going nights. I think it took me about 2 years to finally get my bachelor's degree.
Which was, your major was what?
Biology.
So going back to the beginning, why animals? Why animals, and why natural history? Do you remember something in particular inspiring that?
A frog. Literally a frog. I've always been interested in animals and nature, always, since I was very, very little. And when I was maybe about 6 or 7, the family went out to the grandparents' summer camp out in Princeton. And my cousin Damon and I went down to a brook. It was in those days when you just said, "Hey, we're going to go out to the brook and have some fun," and the adults would just go, "Okay, fine," and you'd run off into the woods. So we were down there playing around in that, wading in it and doing stuff like that. And I was sort of exploring, and I found this big boulder, which looked kind of interesting, like, hey, maybe if I climb up there, jump in, I'll make a big splash. But as I walked over to it, I discovered that in the water there would be 2 shiny gold flat pebbles in the water. And 7 years, hey, gold, I found gold.
That's right.
So I got closer, and the pebbles turned into the eyes of these tiny little frog just floating in the water. And I'd never had a chance to catch a frog before. So
7 years old.
7 years old, kid in a brook, wading through there, desperately trying to be patient and not make a lot of waves and that, because that's what you have to do to catch a frog. And I got up as close as I could and I went for it. Just kind of went right down to the bottom of the brook. And I fished around and I came up with what I just felt like muck and leaves. I thought, oh, I didn't catch it. And then I felt something squirm in my hand. And the head of the frog popped up between my thumb and first finger. And it's one of those moments when you're a kid, you gotta share that.
Of course.
So, I called Damon over, I said, look, I caught a frog. And then I said, I have to go show my mother. So the two of
Naturally.
us. Yeah, of course. So the two of us, run all the way back to the cabin. All the adults are in the kitchen, having an adult conversation. I burst through the kitchen door and said, look what I caught. And I opened my hands just a tiny little bit and that frog jumped. It went over your grandmother's head, missing her by an inch. It arced over the kitchen table and landed in your great-grandmother's teacup as she was bringing it to her lips to drink.
Wow.
And that frog was the moment that got me interested in animals and nature.
A frog in a teacup.
Frog in a teacup, that's what did it. It took a little bit, it wasn't until I was in college at UMass originally, before I transferred here, that I decided what I really want to do is work in zoos and teach people about animals and nature.
Which brings us, we're going to start, your career started at the Ecotarium in Worcester.
Yeah.
You mentioned you had several positions.
Yes.
What was did you have like a main one when you first got employed?
The very first job I had was in education. So I did either stage programs or classroom programs. I also was the gatehouse attendant, the hall supervisor on the weekend, where basically I had to open the place up and shut it down in the evening and try to deal with any issues that came up in the course of the day. I also drove the CP hunting and the train. Those were sort of the four primary ones. Occasionally I'd say, hey, can you help out here, help out there? Yep.
And you pitched in whenever you'd be.
Yes, in a small institution, you wear many, many hats.
Right.
It's not just, matter of fact, when I got hired as a zookeeper at the Ecotarium, one part of the job was 1 day a week, everybody working in the zoo had to run the train. And that you spent the whole day out there giving train rides.
Running the train, which was, it was like a train ride that ran through the entire...
Yeah, looped up along the front and then down where now the mountain lions exhibit is in that space. The layout has changed a little bit from when I was there.
Oh, just a little bit.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second part. Is the Ecotarium different from a zoo, different from a museum? Is it a combination of both?
It's a hybrid. It's, and that was the original concept for it, that it was going to be a hybrid zoo and science museum. Wasn't the first one to have that. It was one of the earlier ones to have that combination. Since then, in particular in the past maybe 10, 15 years, you've seen a lot of science museums that have significant animal collections. Yeah.
Speaking of animal collections, so you go to the Museum of Science, which comes after the Children's Zoo, the Children's Museum.
Children's Zoo.
Children's Zoo in Franklin. So you get to the Museum of Science and you're head of the Animal Center. That's correct?
Yep.
Now, one thing you've been known for is the AZA accreditation.
Yes.
Now, could you briefly explain what the AZA is? And why is it so valuable?
AZA is easy, the AZA accreditation thing. AZA stands for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And they have an accreditation program that an institution can choose to go through. I pushed for the museum to do that. because basically if you succeed with accreditation, you're demonstrating that your animal care, how you use the animals in education and in exhibits and all that is of very high quality. So they call it the good housekeeping seal of approval. It is a rigorous accreditation process. It starts with an application that now is, I think, 40 or 50 pages long. Basically, every single piece of your operation, not just animal care, veterinarian care, education, finances, safety, visitor services, strategic planning, master planning, and you have to answer all these questions and provide supporting documentation. Thankfully, this is all done electronically now. When I first did it, it was still a paper application, and the notebook that we sent down about 25 years ago, I think was about 4 inches thick. Now with paper, we stopped killing a lot of trees in the process. So you send the application down, and it gets a first run through with AZA's Accreditation Commission. Then it gets, they assign a team of your colleagues, your peers, usually a veterinarian, always a veterinarian, and then 1 or 2 people that are knowledgeable about your collection and the types of things you do. So they come out and they look you over stem to stern. They check every aspect of your operation, anything related to animals. That was typically almost, it was supposed to be 2 days, but every time I did it at the museum, it was usually December, and there was always a major weather incident that was going to happen on the day they were supposed to leave, so we would compress this entire thing down to like 1 day of 16 hours or so, which was kind of mind-boggling. At the end of the inspection, they sit down with you and they give you a exit report that basically tells you where you really do really well, your areas that you succeed, areas of major concerns and minor concerns. And then they go off on their way, and your task now is to come up with a plan to address any of these concerns. And that gets submitted, and then you go to the Accreditation Commission meeting, appear before the board to tell them how well you've done with any of the concerns that have come up. And then they kick you out of the room, they make you go sit in a waiting room, and they deliberate, and then they come in and they tell you whether you've been accredited, whether your application has been tabled, or whether you've been denied. It is, I did it, actually just before I left the museum, I was working on their accreditation application for this next go-around, and I didn't leave till that application was done.
That's right.
Yes, and that was a lot of work.
Was AZA, is that annual?
It's every 5 years.
It's
So
every
you go
5
for
years.
accreditation for every 5 years, but it's also a thing that you can't wait till you get the application. So every time I've gone through accreditation, I've said to myself, okay, I'm not going to think about this for a month.
Right.
And I don't. And then after that month, I start thinking about it again. Because the standards are constantly changing. 3 years ago, they redid a lot of the accreditation standard, and they've emphasized animal care, because the accreditation at AZA looks at so many aspects of your operation. The animal care, animal welfare thing wasn't getting as much as it should. So they basically redid the standards where from now on, the focus is animal care and animal welfare. And the Capron Park Zoo, where I'm working now, is up for accreditation in 2022.
So you're undergoing that process yet again.
Yes.
At the new institution.
Right. Probably it will start next year. We'll really start needing to work on it.
So I'd like to go to the transition. You chose to retire from the Boston Museum of Science.
Yes.
A renowned institution, and you decide to become a zoo director at Capron Park Zoo in Attleboro.
Yep.
Do you remember what inspired your decision to retire from the Boston Museum of Science to become a zoo director in Attleboro?
That's a good question. The museum I thoroughly enjoyed, and you know, it was a great experience. The commute in and out of from Worcester to Boston after 30 years was really wearing me down.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
There, you went to UMass Boston, you experienced some of this.
There's
And,
nothing quite like it.
You know, there were just horrible, nasty commutes, whether it was commuter rail or trying to drive in. And I had this one day, I think it was back in April, so a year ago, this past April, and it was a horrible commute. It was just like miserable. I can't remember if I drove in or if I took the train, but it was miserable.
Right.
And I got into the museum, got to my office, sat down, and I thought to myself, I'm done. I can't do this any longer. So I'm sitting in my office and I'm thinking to myself, okay, so you retire from this. What are you going to do? And I thought to myself, no, I got to stay in the field. Right. So I went on the Association of Zoos and Aquariums website, their job site, not expecting to find anything because jobs in New England are kind of scarce because there just aren't a lot of institutions. And Capron Park Zoo showed up looking for a zoo director, and I looked at it and I thought to myself, you've been in the field about almost 45 years, you've applied for that job at least 3 times, and you've never even gotten a nibble.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Why not try it again?
Yeah, try it again.
Sure.
So I applied for the position and realized, you know, with my resume, there's only 2 possible explanations. Is one, I've been doing this since I was 1 year old, or I'm in my mid-60s and I'm thinking to myself, nobody's going to hire somebody in their mid-60s. That's not going to happen, but I'll throw it in anyways. And I had lunch with some friends someplace, I can't remember where, and I was in the parking lot and my phone rang, and I look at it and it's an Attleboro number, and I'm thinking to myself, telemarketer, how did telemarketer get hold of an Attleboro number? And
Absolutely.
Then I realized, oh, wait a second.
I did an interview.
So they called me up to come down for one interview. They called me back for a second interview. And then they called me back to offer me the job, and we talked salaries and salary and benefits. They started with benefits, which usually means the salary isn't going to be
Optimal.
yeah, not optimal, but so my brain was kind of, well, okay, you know, you're retiring, things are changing, maybe you can make things work.
Sure.
And their personnel manager, he goes through all the benefits. I said, so what's the salary? And it was lower than what I was making at the museum. And now what I told him, I said, this is what I'm making right now. And he goes, oh, wait a second. Can you give me 15 minutes? Give me 15 minutes. I said, okay, fine, I don't care. And 15 minutes later, he calls me back and they offer me more money than I was currently making. So I told them they had a zoo director.
So salary negotiations. Yeah.
Salary negotiations. So no, I thoroughly enjoyed the museum. Being a zoo director is something that was my goal through my entire career. So that was very motivated to attempt to get this position.
Which you did, and bringing us to our next question, which I didn't even know. So do you have daily responsibilities? Do you have a routine as a zoo director?
The routine is still sort of a work in progress.
Because you only started like a year and a half? Is it close to 2 years?
No, about 15 months, not even a year and a half.
Okay.
Yeah. Sort of a work in progress, but I get to the zoo and I do my director's rounds, walking the zoo, looking at the animals, talking to staff, see if anything has come up during the day. So I do that, then I meet with my assistant director, sort of go through things we're working on. And then the rest of the day can be a lot of paperwork.
Really?
A lot of paperwork, a lot of research, basically trying to get to know everything about this zoo there is to know as far as its history, its attendance, how does weather impact attendance, and basically trying to put together all the pieces of the puzzle that would help me make hopefully good informed decisions.
Right, which the zoo staff is definitely going to appreciate.
I hope so.
Yeah. Now, outside your office, you've mentioned this before, there's a sound. You
Yes.
hear a sound,
Yes,
and it's an animal.
correct.
Now, what is that animal that's right outside your office?
Well, I have a hearing loss, as you know, so I'm sitting in my office the first week, and I'm hearing this sound, and first I'm thinking my hearing aids are messed up, and then what is that sound? And then I realize I'm hearing an African lion roaring.
That's right.
The zoo has 3 lions. Ramsey's the male, and Kayla and Nyala the female. And Ramsey roars, and you hear him throughout the zoo, throughout the park.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, this is a pretty cool job. I can sit in my office and hear lions roaring.
Which I'm sure the lions will be one of the answers to our final question.
Mm-hmm.
Capron Park Zoo in Attleboro. Do you have top 3 sites that you would say to anybody new visiting the zoo for the first time? Top 3 things that they should see.
Top 3 things, of course, the lions are a Murr leopard. Lacey is quite the character. She was a hand-reared leopard, and she's people-oriented. And she finally recognized me, so she'll be hiding someplace in the exhibit, and she'll do like 3 bounds to cover 40 feet, bounce off the front of her exhibit, jump onto a platform, and then she's on her back like a house cat,
Yeah.
rolling around, rubbing her neck against the post and the thing, just acting like this huge, like, come on in and play with me. I'm cute, I'm cuddly. Yeah, but those canines would be problematic.
Yeah.
So those 2, I think we have one of the few nocturnal animal exhibits left in the country, and the only one in New England, small nocturnal house, and our rainforest. And during the summer, we have a splash pad, which is keeps the kids occupied.
That's right. Yeah, that brings in a lot of
Yeah, it's a good draw.
visitors.
And yeah, so it's a small zoo. It's a good zoo for families with small children. Our audience is families with small children, grandparents with small children, and then older folks, because you can stroll through the zoo and not find yourself exhausted at the end of it.
Right, because it's small enough. Which concludes our interview. I want to thank my father, Lew Stevens, for coming in and discussing his career. Thank you for watching this segment of The Beat. Please remember to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We will see you next time.